Hey there, friend. Welcome back to Daily Dose Radio here in the Bible Bistro. I'm so glad that you've joined me today. We're going to be looking this week at Psalm 143. So if you have your Bible there, why don't you turn to Psalm 143, and we'll be reading today verses 1, 2, and 3. Now, this is a Psalm of David, and that's all we have in the text, although the Vulgate and the Septuagint both have that this is a Psalm of David when he was being persecuted by his son. And in the Vulgate it says his son Absalom, so we know which son we're talking about here. Persecuted by Absalom. So this psalm has a little bit of historical background. Of course, we don't have that in the authorized text. So we have this as a Psalm of David. And this is the seventh and last of the penitential psalms of the church. And it could be perhaps maybe the best one yet. The last one, but the best one. And so we're going to go through this psalm this week. We're going to do it in 4 parts. Now, we're not going to do 5 parts because on Friday is going to be our birthday. And I'm going to do a special podcast concerning the birthday of Daily Dose Radio, which I do every year on the 21st or around the 21st of March. So just today through Thursday, we're going to look at this psalm. So the first section here is in verses 1, 2, and 3. Now, this psalm is nicely laid out for us into 2 parts. If you just take the psalm as it is, you have it divided at the end of verse 6 by a Selah, and then you have the beginning of the second half in verse 7. So it begins in verse 1, "Hear my prayer, O Lord." That's the first petition. And then the second petition, which is the second half of the psalm, is, "Hear me speedily, O Lord." So you have two petitions in this psalm, but it's one psalm about penitence. It is the last of the penitential psalms. So we're going to talk about this conflict against sin and how David saw the remedy, really, for this conflict with sin, the problem with it, what he did about it. And so we're going to see all of that this week as we go through the study of this psalm. So if you have your Bible there, let me read verses 1, 2, and 3. "Hear my prayer, O Lord, give ear to my supplications. In thy faithfulness answer me, and in thy righteousness. And enter not into judgment with thy servant, for in thy sight shall no man living be justified. For the enemy hath persecuted my soul. He hath smitten my life down to the ground. He hath made me to dwell in darkness, as those that have been long dead." All right, that's verses 1, 2, and 3. You'll notice he begins his first petition there. "Hear my prayer, O Lord, give ear to my supplication." So this psalm is a prayer, and he's asking for the Lord to hear. Of course, remember, that's those 2 things, for the Lord to answer speedily and for him to give us an audience. Those 2 twins are the desire of prayer. Everybody has that as a desire for their prayer, that the Lord would hear them and that he would answer speedily. Here it is again. "Give ear to my prayer. Give ear to my supplication. In thy faithfulness answer me, and in thy righteousness." So he's asking God to do a thing in this prayer, to answer now. And then he says there in verse 2, "Enter not into judgment with thy servant." So why in the world would he say that? Well, now of course we have the background, supposedly the background, that this is Absalom's persecution of his father David. But it could also be, and I would dare say that for us in the church, we read this, we're not so concerned about Absalom persecuting us. What we are concerned about is the weight that sin places upon us. And so he says, "Enter not into judgment with thy servant, and for in thy sight shall no man living be justified." We don't have an opportunity to stand before the Lord and say, "Look, it's not my fault." You know, Adam tried that, remember, in the garden? He said, "Well, this woman that you gave me, And he points at Eve. Well, it wasn't her fault. It wasn't her fault. It's his fault. He's the one that sinned. He sinned against God. Sin is always the most personal thing that you can do. It is a decision that you make. And so there's judgment. David says, please don't judge me. He says, who in the world can stand before you and survive your judgment? No one. So sin is the problem. And then he talks about the enemy. Well, here, the sin problem, the enemy comes in there in verse 3. And notice what he says about the enemy. I love verse 3 because it's so incredibly detailed. He says, the enemy has, number 1, persecuted my soul, smitten my life to the ground, that's number 2, made me to dwell in darkness as those who have been long dead. So that's the effect of sin. That's the effect of sin. Persecution of the soul. It's the soul that's being persecuted, right? It's interior. This problem is not exterior. I'm not bleeding because of the cuts or the bruises the enemy's put on me. I'm troubled because he has attacked my soul. And he's smitten my life to the ground because I don't want to sin, and yet I do sin. And so that's why I come before the Lord and I ask him not to enter into judgment, but to remember that I'm dust and ashes and that there's an enemy that I'm fighting here. See, the Christian is harassed by the raging sins that he has adopted into his bosom sins, those things that are always plaguing him. And so this enemy is always present. He says he's persecuted the soul, he's destroying his life, set him in darkness. That's what sin does to us. Is exactly what sin does to us. All right, well, I've reached the end of verse 3, and I've also reached the end of my time. So join me again tomorrow. We're going to take up verses 4, 5, and 6 and see what else he has to say in this first petition. So join me then here on Daily Dose Radio.